Okay, and welcome to the Learning Lounge. I'm Arturo Tejeda, and I'm part of the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Office. I work there as a special project assistant, and here I am with Charlotte Brenner.
Thank you, Arturo. Hello, everyone. I'm Charlotte Brenner. I'm an assistant professor in educational psychology, and I work mainly with beginning teachers, people who are in the teaching education program.
So here we are to have a conversation about transformative spaces based on some of the principles related to equity, diversity, and inclusion. So I think the first question, the main question will be, what is a transformative space for you?
I actually, before we started this venture, I looked online to see how transformative spaces were defined online. And for the most part, I was a little bit surprised because they're often defined as what the physical space looks like. And I think transformative learning, yes, physical space helps, but it's so much more than that. So for me, a transformative space is when students get not just students, but anybody gets the opportunity to surface their beliefs and their values and their assumptions about any topic or anything, and get to know the assumptions of others in a very safe space, and be open to the others' perspectives and challenge their own perspectives over time. And I think by providing people with content, knowledge in a specific area, in this case inclusion, they're able to work that knowledge into their own values and beliefs wherever they're starting at and make those changes internally. And it's going to look different for different people. But I think we firstly have to surface those values and beliefs, open people up to accepting other people's views of looking at things, and then provide opportunities within learning for those beliefs and values to be challenged, and for the person themselves to decide how they're going to integrate this new knowledge into their action and into their internal being.
I can really relate to this definition. I can really connect to this definition. When I think of transformative spaces, like particularly in the learning environment, the first word that comes to my mind is belonging. Like, how do we create a sense of belonging? How do we make sure that the people who are participating, the students who are there, feel like they are acknowledged? Their stories, their backgrounds, their knowledge, the struggles, the reasons where they are there. So for me, that's a central piece, and when we are able to develop that space, we're able to foster that type of environment and that type of dynamic. I think that what we can create, what we allow to emerge in that space, is also the possibility for students to become agents, active agents of their process of learning. They're not these passive recipients or containers of knowledge. They're not just there to receive. They are building. They are part of this process. I think a lot of about the work of Paulo Freire in terms of the pedagogy of the oppressed and these kind of concepts and ideas about how the person who's learning has so much to bring to the table, to the conversations. So for me, a transformative space is about that. It's about creating those possibilities, like making sure we are allowing for this type of dynamics to emerge, to happen, and to allow for those conversations to keep going on, right?
Yes. And I think it's particularly important when we're talking about inclusion and equity, because we can be in a classroom with 40 different stories. Well, we are in classrooms with 40 or 80 different stories. Everybody has a story. And valuing those stories and knowing that we're just seeing the tip of the iceberg of a person and creating that context and where people feel safe enough to talk about where they're coming from. Because initially, there's going to be difference in values. And at the end of the course, there's going to be difference in values because people are in their own places, in their own time. But creating that space where people feel safe enough to share, safe enough to graciously challenge others' beliefs and values and their own, I think is really important. And these things map on to other theories that we know are out there. And the one that comes to mind for me is self-determination theory. You want to support people in being autonomous in their learning. Like you were talking about agency. To me, that's autonomy. You want to create a sense of belonging for all learners, and you want to support their competence, but their competence in being able to socially adapt and share their ideas with other people. Yeah.
And something that I think is very important, and something that you were mentioning, how we have all these different stories, all these different perspectives coming to this place. It also makes me think of how we end up in these places, how we end up taking these positions. We very briefly introduced ourselves, but I think we introduced in terms of, a moment ago, we introduced in terms of our positions and a little bit of what we do, but I think it's also important to know how we end up taking this, or how we end up, taking a position where we consider that this is important. Like, what is the path behind that project to these type of perspectives of transformative spaces related to EDI?
So I think it's a lifetime of experiences. For me, I started my early education in Prince George in a very remote school. It was North Chaco Elementary before there was actually a proper subdivision there. The old school has since burnt down, so it's not there anymore. But within that school, we had a lot of Indigenous students from the reservation, which is very close to the school, in the school setting. And as a 6-year-old, I could tell that some students were being treated differently than others. And I was one of the privileged students in that school. And if something like that is noticeable and troublesome for a 6-year-old, it deserves attention. And it's something, luckily, I had parents that I could talk about these things with, and they could help me see things in a bit larger picture and talk about equity at a very young age. And then as I moved from Prince George into another culture, we moved to Victoria, which was a huge cultural shift for me, but nothing compared to somebody who's moving from another country. And I remember thinking, well, this is tough because things are really different here. But I was born in Canada, and I knew the cultural systems, so that was nothing compared to a lot of people's experiences at the time. And as I went into the workforce, I was exposed to many different lifestyles and ways of living. And then somehow, around 30 years old, I managed to get a teaching degree and worked in schools in inner city Surrey, which were very diverse. And the idea of inclusion and respect became really forefront in everything that was being done in those schools. I worked with some amazing administrators and staff members, and that was very much kept on the forefront. And then when I did go back to university to carry on with my education, that's what I wanted to focus on. How do we create these motivational spaces for learning for all students? Because some students are very much left out in terms of accessing education and resources. I mean, they're in the same building, but they don't have the same background knowledge that allows them to access it. And we need to therefore open up our teaching to other perspectives and change the way we're doing things. And that just kept on going, and here I am at the ULethbridge with this still as my main focus in my teaching and in my life too. Yeah. I'm curious about you too, though.
Thanks. That's great. I think it's so interesting what you were saying about how you have students in the same building, even in the same classroom, and that they're experiencing things in such a different way.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons why I'm bringing this up is because it also makes a lot of sense to me. I introduced myself as part of the EDI office, but there's another part of me here. My relationship with the university it's a mixed relationship because I came here first as an international student. I've been doing my PhD. I'm about to finish in a couple of weeks.
Oh, congratulations.
Yeah. So on the one hand, I had this experience as a student, as an international student. I had the opportunity to taught some courses as part of the sociology department as a sessional instructor. And now I'm in this position in the EDI office. But the reason why I'm bringing this up is because I think for me it was a very important contrast, a very interesting contrast, being here, coming with a completely different cultural background, different language. I'm from Mexico, by the way. So, and then realizing the different challenges that a student that comes with all these different elements can go through in these spaces. And understanding that a lot of these challenges are sometimes they become quite invisible.
Mm-hmm.
We don't think about those challenges. And the reason why I say that is because I never thought about those challenges before coming here.
Yeah.
A lot of these ideas related to equity and diversity and inclusion, they were not something I was keeping in mind when I was teaching before.
Yeah.
But now, like when you go through these type of situations, I feel like at some point it makes you realize the diversity in ways of living these spaces and experiencing these spaces. The other thing that I think of in relation to my own story is how you end up, I don't know, like creating some kind of commitment with others that are also going or have gone through these very multiple ways of learning and being in these spaces, just existing in these spaces. And the interesting thing, the nice thing is that eventually you realize it's not just like an international student, it's not just other international students, but also not only an indigenous student, but also not only a student with disabilities, or not only a student, like we realize that we all have very different and complex, diverse challenges that we need to address and we need to acknowledge and we need to recognize. So in other words, I think this process, this path as a student, here as an international student, as an immigrant, as a person of color, it provides a lot of insight in terms of how to think, how to rethink or rebuild and restructure these spaces. Now, I want to ask another question, like connected to these stories that we have. How do you think that for someone, for a professor who hasn't really had these type of experiences or this contrast, like the ones that you were telling about since you were little and being immigrant, those kind of things, how can we share the relevance? How can we make somebody else to see the relevance of doing this type of work, of transformative spaces, and things like that?
Well, I think reminding them that they probably, because everybody's an individual with their own story, they probably have already gone through some transformative experience in their learning and their growth. You just described one. But I think getting people to realize that we're not talking about a few people. We're talking about everybody. Everybody is coming in with their own story. And we need, as professors, to recognize that. We don't know what's happening below the iceberg. And we're never going to know the whole story. But if we can open up some space, we are going to get students to be more authentic in their learning and more engaged in their learning. And that's without all the well-being pieces that go into that as well. So I think as a professor, it benefits us, regardless of what subject we are teaching, to really consider who we are teaching and their needs as human beings. We're in a world with AI and all sorts of ways of accessing information. We don't need any more information. We need understanding between human beings about how to make this place a better place. And now more than ever, I think these experiences are important to, and we'll talk about strategies about how to do it later on in the conversation. But I think people need to recognize that it's not about just, it never has been just about content, but we're in a space and time right now where we really have to honor human beings and where they're coming from and the connections between our stories before we can start learning in a meaningful way.
Yeah. I completely agree, and I love what you're saying. I think it's so important because sometimes when we talk about these things, I'm in general, things related to EDI, like we see social media, we see things can be very complicated, very complex. But I think it's one of the main aspects that why we need to consider these type of spaces, these transformative spaces, is because this is a reality. As you're saying, this is not something that, like when people talk about these matters, sometimes it sounds like, oh, you're provoking this. No, you're causing this. No, this is already a reality. And we need to understand that that diversity is already here. And that diversity brings many different complexities and can be very rich and can be I think, very meaningful and very positive in terms of the outcomes of learning and building knowledge. But we need to recognize it.
Yes, absolutely. If we don't, I think that's when we end up with these polarized views on things, and people get locked into these very rigid thought patterns, which is not what we want for our learners at all.
Yeah, no, exactly. Now, you mentioned strategies. What kind of strategies have you used?
Well, for my classes, what I do is the first thing, and this goes back to your comment on belonging, I make sure that students know they're in a safe place. And the very first class, within the first 20 minutes, we are coming up with criteria as a class for what safe, respectful, brave conversations look like. It's not me coming up with the criteria, it's the class. And that criteria is written down on a chart paper, and it is kept in the room whenever I'm teaching. Because that is how we function in conversations. There's no disrespect. There's giving of grace to other people. They might not say things correctly, or maybe they're not where you are in your beliefs and values, but we have to always give other people the grace and the benefit of the doubt. So I never have to remind students of that. They come up with the criteria easily by themselves. Then the space is open for us to say, all right, write down your beliefs and values about this particular thing. With me, it's, what do you know about diversity? What do you know about inclusion? And what are your beliefs around inclusion? And they don't have to share that with their peers. They don't even have to share that with me. All I want is people surfacing their beliefs at this point for themselves. And then we get into, there is a place for content, we get into sharing experiences and perspectives and how to open ourselves to others' views and new knowledge. And throughout the course, I also try to embed opportunities through inquiry projects where students can engage in things that they're interested in, connected to course content, but that I can also provide feedback on, and so can their peers, that might disrupt their beliefs or their values. this incongruency is what makes change in people's thoughts and beliefs when things don't fit anymore. And when they're invested in an inquiry project that they have chosen, and they're getting feedback that says, you know, why do you think that? Or how does this work in this situation? It's through those processes that beliefs change, that knowledge is gained, and that transformation takes place. And then at the end of the course, I ask students to resurface their values and beliefs again and look at how they may have changed, maybe they haven't, but normally things have shifted a little bit in some ways. So that's my approach, but yeah, there's some uncomfortable conversations, and that is okay.
Yeah. I think this is a lot about uncomfortable conversations sometimes, and because of how, and exactly because of what you're saying, how sometimes we are not used to being like, we don't know how to act or what to do with what is different, with the contrast. And so I really like your approach, what you're saying, how we can disrupt these ideas just by approaching somebody else, like being contrasted by someone else, like by others' values, others' ideas, and then in the end also by ourselves, like reconsidering what we thought at some point and then where we are now. For me, this is also something that I will say when thinking of strategies or thinking of creating these spaces, is that this is an intentional work.
Yes.
And that and what that means to me is that we can do our best to, like, we can try to be good professors, good instructors, bringing the best content we can. But this is not just about being good teaching something. This is also about keeping this in mind constantly and constantly reassessing the way we are sharing knowledge, the way we are building spaces, the way we are creating certain types of activities or dynamics and so on. So it takes time, and it's a path, it's a process where it constantly feels like, oh, this wasn't as I thought it was going to be. And that also goes to, like, how do we make it explicit? I'm thinking even like when we present our syllabus, when we present these outlines of all the different topics, how do we include specific statements? How do we include our positions on specific matters and specific topics? How students are going to be addressed and recognized and so on. The other thing that I also consider that it's very important in creating these spaces is how not just we recognize the diversity of perspectives inside the classroom, but also in terms of the content. How do we bring different types of perspectives? How do we make sure that we are not just stuck with very fixed traditional perspectives, yes. Which is, I don't want to say it's bad, but I think there's so much more than just one way of looking at a lot of different topics, a lot of different issues, and we need to be able to bring these conversations to the classroom. So for me, that's also very important. And the last thing that I will say in terms like of these strategies is that I like to put myself there in a different position, in a different place. I like to think that I'm trying to disrupt these hierarchies that we constantly yes. see in the classrooms, you know, between the professor and the student. You can tell how a student is very anxious, very concerned when they send you an email because they miss a class or something. And how can we change that yes. dynamic? And for me, one of the ways we can do that is presenting ourselves there as humans that have also gone through all these different experiences, situations, life situations, bringing our own examples of our life examples, making us part of the conversation.
Yes, Oh, I couldn't agree more. And the more you were talking about that, I'm thinking authenticity. I'm thinking we need to come in as authentic human beings with all our flaws and bits and pieces we might not care so much for about ourselves, and be okay with that, because we're all human. We're all learning, or we all should be learning.
Yes.
And that, I think, alone creates that equity in the classroom, is if, as a professor, you come in as a learner. Because like you said, you've got 40, 80, maybe even 120 people that can offer you feedback, that know things that you don't know. So create the space to take some of that in and to change your practice. And I think be uncomfortable. If you're not uncomfortable or having those moments where you're looking back thinking, well, why didn't that work? Or that was, not how I thought this was going to go down, then you're not challenging yourself. So yeah, don't use the same syllabus for 5 years in a row. Switch it up, add something, a couple of things every year that's new, and challenge yourself.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So we are getting to the end of our conversations. So I have one more question. I want to ask you, what would you suggest to professors that are thinking of creating, that want to start creating these transformative spaces? What will be your advice? How can they do it? What do you think is important to consider first if you're just starting to do this?
I think creating that space that is safe. And that starts with creating criteria with your class about what safe, effective, brave discussions look like, both in person and online. Because as soon as that is set up, then you have a space for people to function in. After you've created that sense of belonging in your class, then maybe consider introducing an inquiry project where students can take your content and they can make it meaningful for themselves. And they have the room within that project to bring their true selves to the assignment with their strengths and with their past knowledge. And they can attach new things to what that standing base. I think those two things will get people a very, very long way in creating these equitable spaces. And just always watch your own assumptions. That was something, and I will have to do this for the rest of my life, as we all have to do. We all come into conversations, to settings with assumptions. Just know that.
Yeah.
And check all the time.
Yes, no, absolutely. I think that's super important. The only thing that I will add to this, which I think it's really good advice, is that also approach to those who are already doing this type of work. I think that's such an important thing, not only because we learn from others, but because we also create a network. We learn to support each other. We learn to grow together in this path, in this learning path of being professors, of creating learning spaces, learning environments, transformative learning environments. So that's the only thing that I will add to your response. Well, that's great. Well, thank you so much for this amazing conversation. And well, I think that will be all. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.